The third of the panels for this afternoon on the U.S.-India nuclear deal. I'd like to introduce first myself, Bob Hardgrave. I serve as moderator. I'm a professor emeritus in the Department of Government, and I'm very pleased to be included in these sessions, and especially to welcome my colleague in the Department of Government and director of the South Asia Institute at the University of Texas, Itty Abraham, who is to my right, and then Sharon Squassoni, who is at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington and a specialist in nuclear nonproliferation. She's been long involved in the issues, both in Congress and more recently with the endowment. I'd like to begin by posing a question to my two colleagues. But first, let me set the stage very briefly. After great controversy and doubt as to its passage, the U.S.-India nuclear agreement was approved by Congress by a very substantial majority in both the House and the Senate, and President Bush signed it into law just 2 weeks ago on October 8th. Now, the question I have for the two of you is to really explore the main components of the agreement and where each of you stand with respect to the arguments and the controversies that have been made. Itty, perhaps we can begin with you.
Sure. Thanks, Bob, and thanks to the Strauss Center for this invitation. Let me begin with the conclusion, which is essentially that this is a great deal for India, a not so good deal for the United States, and a very bad deal for nonproliferation. I'd like to say a little bit more, especially about the third aspect of what I've just said, perhaps a little bit later in my comments. But for those of you who've been not following this, let me try and summarize what I think are some of the key aspects of the debates that took place in both countries, which is one way of getting at the question of benefits and costs. As you heard even from the previous panel, being absolutely objective about what the costs and benefits are very difficult. But when you hear about the anxieties that were expressed in different capitals, I think it gives a rather good sense of what people think particular benefits and costs were. From the U.S. side, I think that there were three primary concerns: the weapons effect, the incompleteness aspect, and the multilateral implications. By the weapons effect, I essentially mean that was this a deal that was going to allow India to produce plutonium for its weapons program, essentially by giving it uranium that it could use for its power reactors? It's well known that India is running out of uranium. And the implication of that, for those of you who are interested in Indian military doctrine, is that we realize that the Indian idea of the Indian summary of its position on nuclear weapons, which was minimal, credible deterrence, the weight of those two words, minimum, credible, has shifted from minimum to credible. So India is most likely to try and achieve the amount of weapons-grade material necessary to meet at least what the Chinese have, possibly the British and the French. The incompleteness effect is quite simple. Essentially, 65% of India's reactors, of India's nuclear power-producing capacity is going to be covered by this agreement. And finally, the multilateral implications, which have to do with what does this mean, what are the lessons people are going to draw from this, what is this going to do for non-proliferation more generally. And that's the piece I want to come back to. The India debate, I think, fell around these four large sort of themes. One is the question of separation of facilities. How much was this going to cost? Was this going to be possible? And I think that rather than rehearse the whole debate for you, let me tell you how to think about it today. We need to think about India's nuclear weapons program is divided into a strategic and a non-strategic component, and a safeguarded and a non-safeguarded component. Obviously, the overlap between what is safeguarded and, what is not safeguarded and strategic is the aspect that we want to pay most attention to. The question of testing, namely, is India going to be allowed to test in the future? The question of safeguards and the additional protocol, to what extent was this going to be a loss of sovereignty and prevent Indian nuclear scientists from doing what they wanted to do? And the question of sequencing. This is less of an issue today, but it was a big issue at the time. when people were trying to say, when does India make the various commitments that it wants to? Should the U.S. do certain things first? Should it follow? All of that. It's not really an issue anymore. What this comes down to then is that on both sides, or rather on the Indian side, the debate is primarily one of sovereignty versus ties with the United States. On the American side, you could see almost the flip side of that issue, where you have ties with India being a concern for one group of people versus the implications for the non-proliferation regime. Let me point to some of the implications of what is this going to have for the nuclear picture in India. One is that the Department of Atomic Energy, which has long been one of the most secretive government departments in a country which prides itself on government secrecy, is now going to have to open itself up to a degree never seen before. Don't quite know what that means, but I think we're going to find out for the first time how much money they've spent, even perhaps where some of the waste is stored, some of the effects that they've had, which have pretty much been beyond any kind of civil regulation. We're going to learn a lot more about that agency, and I think it's long overdue that we did. We're also going to find out about whether the Indian, now on a more practical level, and this was something that occurred to me while I was listening to the previous panel, about the question of the Indian electrical grid, whether it's even capable of absorbing the number of reactors that people project we might be able to buy in the next few years. We don't know anything about waste in India, and we're going to find out a lot more about that, where it's stored, how much it is, what's going to happen in the long term. We're talking about the possibility of 16 new reactors over the next 20 years. And finally, capital costs. Where's the money going to come from? All these are the open questions that you want to be keeping your eyes open for. Should I stop at this point and leave the non-proliferation discussion for the next round, or?
Well, perhaps we could, and then pick it up with Sharon.
Sure. Well, thank you, Bob, for chairing the panel, and to the Strauss Center also. It's my first time to Austin from Washington, and I'm enjoying it very much. I'd like to just back up before I talk about the main components of the deal and talk just a little bit about why it was controversial from a non-proliferation perspective. And to do that, I just have to say a little bit about U.S. law. One of the things that wasn't mentioned in the previous panel on the nuclear renaissance is this plethora of nuclear cooperation agreements that, every time you turn around, you see Nicolas Sarkozy, off in the UAE. Actually, I think that the U.S. is just about to sign an agreement with the UAE, a nuclear cooperation agreement. And that is what we signed with India, and that is what the Congress approved. But there is a reason why it was so controversial with India, and that is because India has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It does not have inspections on all of its facilities, which is obvious because it has nuclear weapons. Well, the U.S. changed its laws to make that a requirement in 1978. And one of the reasons why was because India tested a nuclear device in 1974. There were other reasons. At that point in time, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was very new. It didn't have the almost universal application that it has today, and countries such as Brazil and Pakistan and South Korea were seeking some of the sensitive nuclear technologies that you heard talked about in the previous panel, enrichment and reprocessing. So the U.S. at that point said, well, it's not enough to have safeguards. To get more assurance, we need to make sure that countries that we cooperate with are members of the NPT. And at that time, India was not. And we did stop cooperation with them after a couple of years. We had a cooperation agreement with them at the time. It took us 14 years to get the Nuclear Suppliers Group, all the others, well, not all, but most of the other suppliers, to do the same thing. 14 years. Why? Because countries that sell reactors and uranium and everything else want to make money and sell nuclear technologies and goods overseas. The thing that convinced the NSG to change its mind was the example of Iraq in 1991. They were clearly shocked that Iraq had gotten so far in its nuclear weapons development program. All right, so that's a little bit of the background why this was controversial. I think from a non-proliferation perspective, you have to look at two things, and Itty has already mentioned one, which is U.S. obligations. We want to make sure that we are not helping India's nuclear weapons program, because we have an obligation under the NPT as a nuclear weapons state not to help another country's program. And the real place at this point where where some questions are raised is in the issue of enrichment and reprocessing cooperation. In a lot of ways, it's not so much the actual deal, or the actual deal is a problem from a non-proliferation perspective, but it's the details of the deal. And this agreement with India was remarkable because it said, in principle, we might cooperate with India on enrichment and reprocessing. Now, that's a question that the Obama administration will have to come to grips with, because to actually do that, you have to amend the agreement. You have to go back to Congress. But in principle, that was allowed for in the agreement. And that is something that the United States really doesn't do with anyone. You can argue a little bit about Japan, and we actually do allow that in our agreement with Australia, but the tech transfer is the other way. It's from Australia to the U.S. And so that's one question that is going to come up in the future. And then the other issues for concern are how this agreement affects the non-proliferation regime. So how do other non-nuclear weapon states that are party to the non-proliferation treaty, how are they looking at this? Does this, because their basic bargain is, gee, you give up nuclear weapons and you get nuclear energy cooperation in return. Here you have a state that hasn't joined the NPT and it's getting nuclear cooperation in return. I would also add that because India is not a member of the NPT, it also doesn't have the obligations that nuclear weapon states under the treaty have, which is not to proliferate. And then one final point, and then I'll stop, is the NPT is not the only part of the non-proliferation regime. The Nuclear Suppliers Group is another part, and a very important part of the non-proliferation regime. And one thing that they are struggling with now, and which the Obama administration may have to come to grips with, is the question of whether we can further restrict enrichment, these sensitive nuclear technologies, enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. Because the Nuclear Suppliers Group also had to approve this agreement. And when they did that this summer, they did not put any restrictions on that kind of cooperation. And they are meeting actually right now, today, in Vienna. It's been tough slogging, but that was one of the not conditions, but bargains between Congress and the Bush administration when Congress passed this deal this fall, was that Howard Berman, who's chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, basically got a guarantee from Condoleezza Rice that she would go to the Nuclear Suppliers Group and come back with a decision that said no country would cooperate with India on enrichment and reprocessing cooperation. The reason I'll just, if it's not clear, the reason why this is very important is because India's enrichment facilities, they don't enrich for commercial purposes. It's used for their weapons program. Their reprocessing facilities, only one is under intermittent safeguards. But the real point is that if they're not under, even if we cooperated with them with a facility that's under inspection, there is absolutely no way that IAEA safeguards can prevent the transfer of technology and know-how. In other words, I think one of the things you referred to, there's no split in the personnel. So a person working in a safeguarded facility today can walk over to the military facility tomorrow and say, hey, that's how you fix this problem here. I learned it over in this safeguarded facility. So I'll stop right there, and then we could take questions.
I think there's a lot here to pick up on, and I'd like to address more generally the issue of the global non-proliferation regime. Proponents of the agreement, including Secretary of State Rice, have argued that the India-U.S. agreement actually supports non-proliferation. Opponents, obviously, believe that it weakens the NPT and non-proliferation more generally. And I'd like to address specifically a couple of points that you raise, Sharon, and then let both of you really tackle it. first you have the members, the signatories to the NPT. And the question as to whether the India agreement will weaken the NPT and perhaps, as you suggested, provide an incentive for those signatories who have taken on all the obligations entailed to perhaps find a way out, to secure terms more favorable along those provided to India. But there are also, of course, other than India, two other states that haven't been mentioned, Israel and Pakistan. And there are already suggestions that Israel would like to have an agreement along very similar terms. And though certainly there are those in Pakistan who would seek it, I think there's general agreement that such an agreement and the compliance or cooperation of the suppliers group would not be forthcoming. But this raises lots of questions, both for the members, the signatories, and for the two outliers. How would you respond? Maybe Itty, you go first.
Let me think about, I think one of the important things to sort of reaffirm when we're talking about this subject in the United States is that the U.S. has a non-proliferation policy and there is a non-proliferation regime. 65% of the time, I just made up that number, in Washington, those two ideas are conflated, which is that U.S. policy and the regime are assumed to be the same thing, and that's a huge mistake. I think as a result of this agreement and all the complications that have come out of it, we have an opportunity to separate the two. Let's acknowledge that U.S. non-proliferation policy has failed. And it's failed for the simple reason that when you, and this is not just something, when you add up North Korea, Iraq, and India, what you essentially come up with is a conclusion which says that a country that wants to defy the United States, but has reached a certain point in its nuclear weapons development, is going to be able to cut a deal with the United States. In other words, if you're going to do it secretly, do it soon, and as long as you get to a certain point, the U.S. isn't going to be able to do anything. If you do it long and hard enough, you get a deal like India got. So, from the U.S. point of view, I think there is no policy anymore, and the sooner we all recognize that, the better. There is, however, a non-proliferation regime out there, which is still taken seriously, and the easiest way of thinking about that is to realize that the great majority of countries in the world do not want nuclear weapons. They haven't tried to get them, they don't want to get them, and they are appalled by the number of nuclear weapons out there in the world. This, I think, was particularly visible to us in 1995, when the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, was extended indefinitely, which nobody expected, and it was led by countries who take this question of nuclear weapons extremely seriously. What makes these countries special is that they're all countries, or for the most part, they're countries that could develop nuclear weapons themselves, but have chosen not to. That particular moment, which I think was a critical moment for the strengthening of the regime, was lost soon afterwards. A variety of different things happened. Probably the Indian and Pakistani tests in 1998 were the thing that put it to bed right away. But I think that if the United States, which has in its interest a desire not to have more proliferators out there, steps away from its own particular national interests and way of defining this problem and returns to the global community saying we have something in common, which is that we don't want to see more countries develop nuclear weapons, I think the real pressure and the real strength of the regime can be enhanced and U.S. interests can be furthered without it becoming a U.S.-centric issue. The key issue to me is the link between proliferation and disarmament. Now, it's been said a million times, but it's worth saying again. The Non-Proliferation Treaty includes an article, Article 6, which asks the nuclear weapon states to take serious and credible steps towards disarmament. The United States could eliminate 90% of the weapons that it has, the warheads that it has, and still have more weapons than anyone else in the world. What is preventing it from doing it? Very, very little. Meaning, from a strategic point of view, it's not going to be any weaker than it was before. The impact that that particular decision would make, the signal that it would send to the rest of the world, is that the U.S. is finally serious about doing something about disarmament. And I think that moving in that direction is something that would be extremely low cost, extremely high value in terms of the larger interest that the U.S. has, and I think would regenerate or revive the NPT process, the non-proliferation regime process, in a way that very little else will. The real issue, however, we can get to the point where every country, or the 7, 8 countries that have nuclear weapons, have no more than, say, 200 warheads, which is roughly what China has at this point. At that point, though, we still have a problem, which is that nuclear weapons are still associated with ultimate security. So the real step towards disarmament, or the real step towards making the world safe in the future, isn't just about reducing the numbers. It's about the United States in particular delinking the idea of ultimate national security with nuclear weapons in some way. Now that's a much more difficult project to take on, but that is the actual link that has to be made for this process of disarmament to be taken seriously. Let me get Sharon in and we can come back to Israel and Pakistan.
Fine.
I couldn't agree with you more. I would add a few things on there. The Bush administration did say that there were non-proliferation benefits to this agreement, and part of that was the seven steps that India was going to take. For example, putting facilities under safeguards, committing to maintain its nuclear testing moratorium, supporting cutoff negotiations, those kinds of things. Leaving those aside, I think your question was very focused on, would other states or already parties to the NPT leave the NPT, seeing that, become so disgruntled that...
The elephant in the room, of course, is Iran. Probably the only country among the signatories who really might try to use this as an avenue for opening.
I do think that Iran looks very carefully at the example of India. And I think they see analogies in terms of, great civilizations and countries that have, that play strategic roles, all of that. But I don't think they're looking at this deal as a way to get out of the, that they would use it as a rationalization to get out of the NPT. If they're going to do that, they're going to do it on its own. But I think that there are more subtle effects of this deal that do weaken the NPT. One is the nuclear weapon states are looking for ways to strengthen certain things, like they want all countries to adopt the additional protocol, which is a safeguard strengthening measure. If I were a Brazil, for example, I would say, well, India got a sweetheart deal. They're not even a party to this treaty. Why should I take on additional responsibilities? It's a broader dissatisfaction of some non-nuclear weapon states, as Itty mentioned. But the messages, I think, are very damaging to NPT party states, which is, some nuclear weapons are okay. If they're in the hands of our friends, like India, that's fine. Now, you could say, well, countries already look at the U.S. and Israel and say the same thing, but we're not so far engaging in nuclear cooperation with Israel, although that is definitely an interest of Israel. I could even say, actually, India, shortly after the whole thing was signed, came out, some Indian officials said, well, we don't see any problem with doing the same thing for Pakistan, which I think is a very, certainly surprising turn of events. But it also, the whole discussion around the U.S.-India deal, I think goes to your point about nuclear weapons and prestige. This really underscored that, okay, India, you develop nuclear weapons, you are not going to bargain them down to get any of this. We are not going to, we're going to give you de facto a legitimacy by not even touching anything to do with your nuclear weapons program. And that, I think, is a real failure of U.S. policy. And I would say, on the whole, that until we do move closer to zero, which is certainly not in my lifetime, unfortunately, but it's going to be very hard to take away that prestige. And I would say that, or to degrade that prestige to the point where countries say, oh, nuclear weapons, they're costly, they create, in lots of environmental damage, you can't use them, and it just doesn't make sense. Some reasonable countries, I think, have already come to that conclusion. I would add, though, on the disarmament, not only do we need to bring down our nuclear weapons, but we need to pursue very seriously a comprehensive test ban treaty and a fissile material production cutoff treaty. And here is where things get dicey for India, because it doesn't really support, well, I don't know, maybe you know more than I do, a comprehensive test ban treaty or an FMCT. And those are prerequisites on any path toward disarmament. And I think you will see an Obama administration be very serious about those two efforts. And it should be interesting to see how the U.S.-Indian relationship may respond to that.
Sharon, earlier you talked about the permeability of the boundary between the safeguarded, inspected reactors and facilities under the agreement and those that are not, those that remain really within the military and weapons sphere. You talked about the knowledge that can be simply moved across the boundary as a scientist goes from one reactor to another. But there's another